Well, welcome back to Theology in Action. My name is Tony Caffey. I'm the senior pastor of Verse by Verse Fellowship in San Antonio, Texas. And I'm here today with my friends, Tom and Michelle Didier. So glad to have y'all today as we talk about theology in action. And we're going to talk about parenting, which is something y'all know a little bit about. Is that fair to say?
A little bit, yep. We have 5 kids. We've been married for 22 years now, and so our youngest is 8, and it goes up to our oldest who's 17.
Okay, quiz question. I'm going to press you, and I'm going to go after Tom, because I think, Michelle, you could do this. So all 5 kids' names, first name, middle name, and age in 20 seconds. Ready? Go. In sequence.
Wow, that's tough. Okay, so Noah Thomas is 17, Emma Grace is 15, Elijah Paul is 11. No.
Oh, got
I
him.
failed. Emma Grace is 15, Elijah Paul is 13, Nathan James is 11, and Samantha Joy is 8.
Well done, Tom. Yeah, I heard a Nate Bargatze bit recently where the school where his kids went to school, they called him and said, "Which bus is your daughter on?" And he's like, "I don't know. Ask, why did you call the dad? Call the mom. I don't even know what school she goes to." So,
Exactly. Well, it's hard enough to do that, but if you say the birthday, like, November
When they were
3,
born?
yeah, when they
You
were
got
born
that
is
one.
even, I can do that, but it does take a little concentration to get there.
and you know what school they go to.
Absolutely. That one
Okay.
I do have down.
Good. So y'all homeschool.
We do.
Tom, you're an anesthesiologist here in San Antonio. Michelle, you're a homemaker, home wife, homeschooler. So doing that work. What's your biggest challenge as you lead 5 kids through discipleship and schooling?
I think my biggest challenge is working through my shortcomings and my failures on a stage of my kids and constantly seeing their weaknesses and my weaknesses and working through that.
Yeah. And they remember things, don't they,
They sure
children?
do. Yeah.
So let me ask you this, just as we get our conversation going. I got 6 questions. I want to see where this goes, but I'll start with this one. Is there a right way to parent kids?
Yeah, I think that's traditionally one of the much debated questions, isn't it? Is there one right way, and should we prescribe ways to parent?
Yes.
And I think the answer is there's lots of right ways and there's lots of wrong ways. So I don't think there's any one right way, but there are many ways I think we would agree are wrong. And I also think at the same time there are many ways that can be right. So parenting is a lot of following biblical principles in ways that your conviction leads you to. So the end result might be different, even though the foundation is similar, the same.
I guess we could ask what are some wrong ways, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit as we process this. We're Christians. We go to the same church. We believe in the authority of the scriptures. So let me kind of pivot to that. The right way, as we think that out a little bit, what does biblical parenting look like, especially in our current culture? Michelle, if you want to tackle this one, there's a lot of wrong ways. There's a lot of approaches that we wouldn't agree with as Christians, but help me understand what biblical parenting looks like, especially today.
I would say one thing that we have been very proactive in doing is really limiting kind of their exposure to things, specifically technology and social media. I don't think I've ever heard any parent that I've talked to that have been like, "Oh, I wish I would have given them a phone younger," or "I wish they would have been on social media younger." And then it kind of flips it. Then the exposure, then we get to be controlling of what they're exposed to and when, and if it's appropriate for each individual kid. I think in our culture, I think that's what's been a blessing with homeschooling is that we're able to kind of filter through what they receive till they get to a certain point. Then we can kind of set them free, and then we have that trust relationship where we can kind of work through that as they're encountering new things that they don't know what is.
And do you have opportunities to kind of incorporate a biblical worldview, what I would call a biblical worldview, into all of their subject matter? You got science, you got history, you got the essentials that kids need as they grow up. But with the way that you're going about it, you can
Absolutely.
approach it with a theistic viewpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, choosing curriculum as a homeschooler, there's so many options to have where like the curriculum that I use uses all of the timeline and it incorporates biblical time things along with historical things, which is really neat to see. They're not
Yep.
separate, they're intertwined. So it's been good.
When I was young, I was homeschooled for a few years, did some public school, did some private school. It seemed like it changed a lot depending on where my parents were. But there was like maybe 2 curricula, out there. So, and my parents used Abeka, which I know is still out there. We used that for Alistair when he was younger. But now there's a barrage of options. So how did y'all sort through all of that?
That's a good question. Well, usually the first thing I tell people is kind of figure out what your philosophy of education is.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of different philosophies you can do. Book, you can do all online, you can do classical methods, it can look however you want. So figure out what resonates with you as the person who's doing it. And then that kind of helps narrow it down. I knew for me, I didn't want lots of textbooks. I wanted to do things that were nature, field trips, lots of books.
Oh, okay.
So to me, that was important in those early years. I think when you get older, it's all kind of the same: desk work, hard textbooks and those kinds of things. But when they're younger, so that's kind of how we went from there. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we did even some of my old books from when I was a kid. My mom still stored them, and we used them for Alistair 20-something years later, which was kind of cool because got to use my textbooks and probably still had some of my underlining and highlighting in them. So there's a lot of options, I think, for homeschooling and kind of building curriculum into what you do with your kids. But let's maybe ask some broader philosophical, theological questions about parenting. And I'll kind of, here's how I want to go about this. I want to ask what fathering looks like biblically. And I'm going to ask you, Michelle, in just a moment to answer that on behalf of Tom. And Tom, I'm going to start with you. Like, I heard recently that there's no such thing really as parenting. There's just fathering and mothering. Like they're so distinct, even though you guys are a team working together, that to combine them is to make a mistake. Like, no, there's enough distinct aspects to fathering that we should use that verb or that, a participle instead of mothering. So maybe let's approach it that way. What does biblical mothering look like? And how do y'all go about doing that? And how does Michelle enact that in y'all's family?
Yeah. So I think that mothering biblically is to nurture wisdom to the glory of Christ. I think that we often see that in Proverbs, probably best displayed,
Yep.
and it's seen in the description of wisdom and folly, lady wisdom versus lady folly. And so when we consider mothering biblically, we see that same thing. Wisdom is essentially nurturing your children or those who you're responsible for in maturity and in seeing the world more like God does. In our family, Michelle does that in a great way. She does it through teaching and through homeschooling. She does it intentionally and purposefully as well, and with an end in mind. So that nurturing, she knows, I've seen it, she knows the end product that she wants, so she's able to give the plant or the child what they need in order to get them to that end result.
And those are things that, as you think about your own fathering role, you can't offer or don't offer, or can you maybe show us how God designed it where there's that combination of fathering and mothering?
Yeah, I offer it in a different way. And I think as mom, she does it in a better way. She's a better nurturer, and she often represents wisdom better than I do as well. The way that she does it primarily is through time. So she spends more time with the kids, so she's able to give the individualized, detailed attention that I'm not always able to give. And in that way, that is sort of, I would say, the distinguishing factor, the distinguishing characteristic of nurturing.
And I've seen that even with parents that both, work full-time outside the home. There still is more of a nurturing component with the mother. And, most of the time I've seen too, there's more time investment, even if mom and dad are both working 40 hours outside of the home. So let's flip that, Michelle. What's the father's role in parenting kids, and how does Tom approach that in y'all's home?
I would say help shaping our kids to understand who God is by establishing trust, by knowing that they can trust their dad in all situations, especially in fear. They trust him to provide for them. When they don't maybe understand all the outside things that are going on, they can trust dad. And Tom does that well by providing, by, challenging the kids to do some risk things, but explaining how to go through that in a careful way and a smart way, whereas I tend to be like, no, don't do that. And I think, and building that trust relationship is spending time with them, explaining who God is to them purposefully. Usually like bedtime is always kind of a good time, and that you're purposeful about doing that.
So there might be some debate about this. I'm curious what y'all think, but if I were to say primary disciplinarian in the home is whom?
I would say me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would say so too. Just based mostly on what we talked about before, which is
Because
time.
of the time factor?
Yeah, exactly. So she's around them more, and we believe strongly that issues need to be dealt with right away if possible. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, if an issue comes up, we're both equipped to deal with it, but Michelle is often forced to deal with it more than I am.
Have you ever used the phrase, wait till your father gets home?
I have used it, yes.
Did it work?
No, because his schedule is so irregular. They'd be like, well, I hope it's a late day. Maybe he'll forget.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there moments that, this is personal, so we'll have to see, if y'all want to show this to your kids later, but are there times when maybe mom and dad aren't in agreement on how to move forward with a disciplinary matter? How do you resolve that?
Yeah, sometimes, for sure. In those situations, they're normally tough situations that require some nuance anyway.
Yep.
So generally, they're not dealt with dynamically. There's a little bit of time between whatever happens until the time where we talk with whoever it was that does that. So in that period of time, we'll discuss what we think is the best way forward. And then almost all the time, I can't think of any exceptions now, but when it comes to discipline or sort of dealing with issues that come up, we usually come to some sort of agreement. At least, we might differ on sort of the degree of consequences or something, but in principle, we generally agree on what should happen next.
And normally I just add context to the situation because I was there when it happened, or this may be why this happened. This is something I've seen. So usually we're pretty in agreement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, y'all did a really fantastic presentation at one of our Walk the Talk seminars. It's about 2 months ago. And the focus of that time was really to help, I think, young parents understand the basics of discipline and child raising. So it's part of the reason I wanted y'all to come today, because you're not so removed from the situation. You still have some young ones that you're actively disciplining, and but at the same time, you'll have a lot of experience now. You got somebody who's right on the cusp of kind of moving out and starting life on his own. So, I mean, when y'all made that presentation, one of the things that y'all emphasized, which I took some notes from, is RFR, this great acronym. And I was in the room, I saw these young parents with toddlers and young kids, writing feverishly like RFR. So what is RFR? And maybe y'all can just give us a little synopsis of what y'all shared at that event and how that was so helpful for y'all with child raising.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll let Michelle describe that process. But to step back and to put it into context briefly, when it comes to parenting, like we mentioned before, there's biblical principles I think that we can all agree on, things that come directly from the Bible and things that are prescriptive, how to treat our children, how God treats us, and things that we can extrapolate from there are not necessarily prescriptive, but they're tools in a tool belt. And so what RFR, it's a tool in the tool belt that we think is important, that we've seen result in some really positive things for our family, but That being said, it's not directly from the Bible, so therefore I wouldn't say it's prescriptive, but it is useful. So with that being said, do you want to describe what it is?
Sure. So the first R stands for repentance, and then forgiveness and restoration.
Which are very biblical words.
Yes. And we didn't come up with this on our own. This was something
Yeah.
that we had read and done a class with many years ago. But this has really helped us deal with conflict. Conflict between me and the kids, or the kids between each other, or the kids with anybody. But it really worked well between siblings, giving them tools to how to deal with conflict, which obviously conflict resolution is biblical as well. So
And you're saying that siblings conflict.
yes, yes, yes.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. No, I know that to be true.
So, describing the repentance part, the relationship is broken. So, if we use an example of between me and one of the children doing something, that relationship is broken, whether they disobeyed or they talked back or something. They would then be isolated, whether it be going to their room or sitting in a corner, just to provide that physical isolation, with the purpose of the chance of going to the next step would be forgiveness and restoration. So the goal is for them to sit in isolation until they are ready for restoration, which could be a short amount of time or a long amount of time. And when they're ready, they have to initiate. They get out from the chair. So it's not really like a timeout in terms of using it as a correction. It's the purpose of it is using it for restoration. So when they sit down, then they come, they initiate, and they will say, "I was wrong for hitting my sister. Will you forgive me?" And I have found that phrase to be very helpful because it not only names what you did wrong and then asks for forgiveness instead of just the "I'm sorry" kind of what I remember doing as a kid.
I'm sorry you felt that way.
Yes, which doesn't have any ownership over
Yeah.
the action. And so this has actually been very transformative for me personally because I had, by giving my kids that phrase of something to say, then when I lost my temper at them, I felt very convicted and I said, "I'm sorry, I lost my temper. Will you forgive me?" And by having that phrase of what to say, they all were like, "Oh yeah, no problem. I forgive you." It forced me to have the humility to own my sin and then ask for forgiveness. And so it's been life-changing for me as well. So then that's the repentance. And then the forgiveness is a short one because usually that's just granted by the person.
That's the offended person offers that.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. And then the restoration. So depending on the crime, usually the next question the child should ask is, "Well, what can I do to make it right?"
Yeah.
So I feel like they broke a toy or knocked down a tower, or they dishonored something or someone by doing something. I usually try to have them figure out what it is to make it right. So they have to come up with, well, I should go and help rebuild the tower that I knocked down, or I need to then go apologize to that child. So like if they hit somebody, they'd ask me for forgiveness, but then I usually would say, now you need to do the same thing to your brother and sister so that they also ask for forgiveness. And it's important when they come to you that make sure that their heart is humble, because sometimes they can come kind of sulky, and I usually turn them back and say, I can tell you're not ready by your tone or your body language, so go back and sit until you're ready. And so I feel like that's really helped our kids deal with conflict. And sometimes they just need to sit just to calm themselves down. That it's not a punishment. It's not isolation's not like necessarily a negative thing. It's supposed to be a reflective time. And because it's a reflective time, it's up to them to decide how long that they're there.
So let me ask in that, how much do you as a parent oversee the process? Or, are they initiating on their own and maybe you're not even in the room when they're kind of going through the RFR process with the offended person, the offender? Or are you hovering over the situation to make sure everything is right?
I mean, definitely when they're younger, you have to
Yeah.
model it for them.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would even role play if an offense was done to one who couldn't speak, I would then talk for the toddler.
Okay.
So that to give that role play, like if they hit the younger one, then I would pretend to be that person and say, oh, this, just to give them that dialogue and to know the give and take of what that conversation is. As they're older now, I hear them take care of it on their own. They don't necessarily put themselves in isolation. That's kind of when, those times when they don't have self-control, those kinds of things. I feel like they're better now that they're older. They can hey, that hurt my feelings when you did this. Why did you do this? And they're able to like just talk about it and work out some solution.
From the offended person's perspective, have you run across situations where forgiveness is withheld? How do you, project on them, like this is an expectation of our household?
I usually find kids are very forgiving. They usually like bounce back pretty quickly. I think just admitting what they did wrong and asking for forgiveness, usually they're like, oh, because they long for that restoration, whether it be with me or with each other. So I can't think of any specific examples. It's probably more on my end. I think as you get older, you kind of...
We're unforgiving.
Yeah, I think kids just let things kind of wash off. Maybe some of them would hold on to those things internally, but then I maybe not see those as quickly.
I can think of a couple of times that has happened, and it depends on the situation, but we've either given them a little bit of time and then revisited them individually later, or in the moment, if it looks like they're just holding on in the moment and it needs to be addressed, then we'll sort of work through that with the person that's holding on to it. So it requires a little bit of discernment to determine whether this is something that's maybe long-standing and needs a little more time, or whether it's something that we can deal with immediately and try to impress upon them the importance of restoring that relationship. And I think the real fruit in the process that we've seen is, like she said, when the older ones are able to resolve conflicts on their own. Broken relationships and conflict is a part of life. And when you see it not go right in adults, it's very discouraging and it can be hard to deal with. And it can lead to long-lasting bitterness and long-lasting issues that manifest themselves in a myriad of ways. So it's a very basic skill to learn, but it's essential. And especially in the context of a church. So if we can equip our young people with ways to deal with conflict and restoring relationships, then we can display who Christ is to other people through that process.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, so RFR for adults as well. And in a way, it's Matthew 18, but it's customized for the home environment. Mm-hmm. So person sins against you, you go, you take your sin to them, and then you gain your friend back, you gain your brother, your sister, your sibling, or in some cases it sounds like maybe you offended mom and dad, and mom and dad are a part of the equation as well. So let me press on this a little bit. So RFR, the mechanism, the technique, I could kind of package that and sell it to a local public school for conflict resolution in the home, or to maybe a Muslim community could take it and utilize it, or a Jewish community outside of the framework of Christian faith. So how do you insert into this, and maybe just more broadly in the life of your children, this is discipleship at work. This is mom and dad discipling you and making you followers of Jesus, even as we're using this mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. So relationship restoration, the best example of that for us is what Jesus has done for us on the cross. And so the degree to which he has gone to restore a right relationship with him through coming to earth as a man, dying, living a sinful life, and then dying and rising again from the dead. It's hard to trump that. You might have damaged your brother or sister's tower, but in light of Christ, if we can put that in context of what Christ has done for us, it's pretty easy to sell the importance of restoration. It's pretty easy to understand the uniqueness of what he's done for us, and therefore it's easier to forgive and to restore our relationship with others. Yeah,
that's good, and that I would think would propel them to naturally forgive, and maybe that's why they do it so easily, because you lay it on really thick with them. Do you know what Jesus did for you? No, I'm not saying you do that, but if it is part of our religious, core belief, like we believe that we've been forgiven so much, why wouldn't we forgive other people if they've got that? They've inculcated that in in life and church and in their faith, then it should come easy. To be honest, it should come easier for us as adults.
It should. Yeah.
Shame on us for being so unforgiving.
Right. Well, it's hard to show grace, but in light of the grace that God's given to us, like showing grace to one another is important. It's an important marker of maturity and an important marker of just relational skill as well.
And I think when there have been some kids who maybe struggled with, giving up forgiveness, I have said, well, that yesterday you were in reverse. You know what I mean? And something I think what it feels like to have that, to want to have made the mistake and want the forgiveness. And I think and then of course reflecting that to Christ, it is an easy concept.
Yeah, I've talked about that in the context of marital counseling. Like you want to be a forgiving person because you're going to want to be forgiven down the road for similar things, and you don't want to create a cycle of unforgiveness in a marriage that'll spiral downwards. So let me just throw out a phrase that I've heard before that I appreciate, and we can just interact with it, and y'all can tell me how this works with your five. Paul Tripp has said, and I've quoted before, we don't want to raise good kids, we want to raise gospel kids. And that really is different, although, to raise gospel kids, I think in doing that, you are, in effect, raising good kids. But what's the difference between, let's say, just bland behavior modification and a real, like, Christ-centered goal to be more like Jesus?
Yeah. Good kids that behave the way that we want them to behave, I think, is kind of what that quote is getting at. And one thing
that make us look good.
That make us look good,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. There you can sort of get that feedback from other people. Your kids are so well behaved or something like that. But you're right. That's not what we're going for. We're going for their heart. We're going for a heart that responds to the Holy Spirit and that leads to a heart that is responsive in glorifying God through the rest of their lives, a real genuine outpouring in their behavior that reflects what their heart is. And so a lot of the debate in parenting is, how do you get there, right? How do you go from a seed or a young person to a fully developed, mature person? And behavior is part of that. And training for behavior is not what we're after. So I think one thing is having the end goal in mind, having the long haul in mind. That's one thing. The next is to have discernment in terms of how to deal with behavior. So if behavior is not good, is it childish folly or is it a sinful heart with some intentions that are not right? And our response to that behavior is different, right? If it's childish folly, it might just require correction or some training. But if it reflects a sinful heart, then it requires a different process. And so that discernment of being able to figure out, are you doing this for what reason, is important. And the same with the good behavior too. Are you showing good behavior without the heart? And so I think having that end in sight and having discernment is really important. And then also, as you come upon these things and as you're dealing with a character issue or a behavior issue, we try to teach as we go. So a lot of times it requires going back and reviewing a situation with a child, giving them the moral reason why we think it's this way or that way, but not just the moral reason as in it's right or wrong, but also incorporating the gospel into that. And as parents, we fail in many ways. And so ultimately, it's a trust that the Spirit is working in there to use our words and our efforts to try to foster their heart. But like we said before, we're trying to nurture the heart. And hopefully it leads in good behavior. Sometimes it doesn't always, but it requires patience to get there. And so that long-term view, I think, is really important.
And that RFR terminology does have gospel connections. Mm-hmm. So part of that pattern is an enactment of the gospel. There's repentance, there's forgiveness, there's restoration. So it's not a perfect, corollary, but it's close, where you can talk through the nature of our sinfulness and our need for grace, even as you're disciplining them. So that's good. Let me piggyback on that, and since we are talking about gospelized kids and not good kids, not just good kids, but gospel kids, how do we, I'll add myself into this since I'm a parent, how do we shape hearts as parents and not just kind of go after what you were saying, Tom. We want them to make us look good. We want other people to be impressed by them. How do we really get beyond just making them do things that we like and get to heart shaping activities and that heart work inside of our kids?
Any thoughts?
I, I think definitely giving them the reason why you do things. We share because that shows how you love each other, and trying not to think of yourself always first. And a lot of times when there's situations, I like to revisit it once the conflict is past, whether that means in a few hours or the next day. I feel like I have a much better conversation with my kids post-conflict.
Yeah.
I made that mistake early on. I think, well, it's the problem here. Let's just deal with it. But there's lots of emotions and things going on at the moment. So doing it in a non-conflict situation is very helpful.
So you circle back
Yes.
and see if the RFR is actually reached.
And to see if they have any
final conclusion.
reflections, like, why did you do this? Or why do you think, because you know how sometimes you do something, like you tear someone down just to elevate yourself, or you try to ask, like, well, why do you think that you did that? Or why did they do that to you? Is it because they're jealous? Why do you think have more of that? And then it's more, there's nothing on the line because they already have gotten in trouble. They've already had the consequences. Now it's just like a regular conversation. That has really helped. And I think having them understand why you do certain things.
When we first had a baby, it was really uncomfortable for me to sing to him because I wasn't used to expressing myself very much, especially in front of a baby who doesn't interact back. And so as you become a parent, you become used to sharing and expressing yourself in ways that aren't necessarily returned. And as we talk about shaping hearts, one thing that I've learned is important, and I'm still growing in it, is to sort of speak more, to talk more. Why are you doing this? Or why am I doing this? To explain to them what the purpose is behind it. Going to church is one example. We get up and we go to church, but we don't just go to church. I explain why we go to church and why worship is important and why the message makes a difference in our lives and so forth. So I think that willingness to be expressive and to share and to model who Christ is to your kids is important. And that requires a little bit more intentionality than just asking for good behavior in church. It's better if they understand the importance of worship and they actively participate in worship.
Is there a time when you say, because I said so? Can we say that as parents?
Definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely when they're
for
young.
sure.
I think when they're preschoolers, they're like black and white.
Yep.
They just need that, like, tell me what to do.
Right.
So yeah, there's definitely that stage.
Yeah, it's not bad to demand behavior.
But as they
the bigger
age,
picture.
you do need more reasoning. You do need
Mm-hmm.
more backing up why we do the things that we do. I've seen that, and maybe getting out in front of that when they're younger, maybe when they're not quite able to grasp the why, but you're still telling them why, logs it away so that they're less inquisitive in that matter later on.
Yeah, for sure. And sort of the great debate is, does the heart lead to behavior or does behavior guide the heart?
The chicken or the egg, right?
Exactly.
Which comes first?
Yeah, exactly. And there's different parenting philosophies based on that idea alone. And I would say it's both. And good parenting incorporates both techniques.
So final question, because y'all do have a pretty good age range and y'all have worked from, the toddler stage to now teenagers, what's the biggest change in the way in which you've parented when your kids were young to now getting older? And then if you want to touch on this, like, how do you anticipate as you look beyond their teenage stage into adulthood, how your parenting role is going to change even more as they start to move on in life?
Yeah. Well, one thing that we really haven't talked much about yet, but it's the role of prayer in parenting and an acknowledgement that we are stewards of God's child more so even than our child. And so consistent, regular prayer for our kids, for ourselves, for our marriage, for our relationship with God sets the foundation for how to proceed in that. And so it's sort of assumed behind all the things that we said, but it really is important. And as our kids get older, I've learned that that's an even more important thing. The process of parenting is a lot like a slow process of letting go in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
in that infants require care and attention all the time, and an 18-year-old should theoretically require very little. And so our job as parents is to get them to be able to do that by the time that, they leave the house. Whether that means, we talked a little bit about exposures and sort of controlling what they're exposed to, whether it's a gradual increasing of that, a gradual increasing of responsibility, or a gradual increasing of other things, such that you go from controlling every aspect of their lives when they're infants to not needing and not controlling any aspect of their life by the time that they're ready to leave the house, because they're going to be on their own that next day anyway.
Yeah. How about from a mother's perspective? Biggest change is the kids have gotten older.
It's definitely that letting go. I mean, when they're real little, you're doing everything for them, holding them, feeding them, doing everything to not taking responsibility for those things. And it's fun to watch them have control. And sometimes it's difficult because sometimes they don't do a very good job, or they drop the ball, and letting them kind of figure out why that is or how to do that. I see myself now becoming more on like a coach instead of in the fields, like with them. Now I'm a little bit more on the sidelines cheering for them, and that's it's fun. It's a lot of fun to see them be who they are, and but it's sad too not being needed as much or in that same way, but it's definitely how God intended. I mean, you intend to send them off, and to hold them back would not be helpful for them.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I appreciate the steward analogy and thinking that way. Although, your parenting role will always be there, and then you grandparent, after that, and there's always involvement in their life. I think it is helpful to see it as God's gift to us, that we're used for a time. We have 18 years or so, and then we give them over to God. And actually, you're kind of always giving them over to God, right? But then it's like, okay,
You really,
off you go.
Yeah.
You guys are going to make me start crying here. My son is 17, so we should probably stop. Thank you all for this. This has been good, and appreciate the work that y'all do with parenting and maybe unpacking some important concepts for us today. Well, that's all for Theology in Action. If you want to learn more about marriage and conflict resolution in that particular relationship, you can watch the video with me and my wife, Sonia, as we talk through some of the rules that we use for conflict resolution as we teach other couples. So until then, we'll see you next time on Theology in Action.